Welcome to Health Bites, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It is my pleasure to introduce our expert speaker this morning, Dr. Judy Goforth Parker. Dr. Parker is the Commissioner of Health Policy for the Chickasaw Nation. She previously served as the Secretary of the Chickasaw Nation Department of Health from 2009 to 2018. She has many years of experience working to increase quality of healthcare for Native Americans throughout the United States. She has a PhD in nursing from Texas Women's University and has completed her nurse practitioner degree at the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center. Dr. Parker completed postdoctoral studies in the inaugural cohort of the Meharry Medical College postdoctoral degree program. Her focus included curriculum development in health policy for young Chickasaw scholars, development of health impact assessment and health impact checklist tools, development of a quarterly newsletter on health policy, and she partnered on writing a scholarly article related to policy around maternal mortality in American Indian and Alaska Native women. In today's Health Bites, Dr. Parker will give a presentation on food sovereignty, a working definition. Thank you so much, Dr. Parker, for being our expert speaker this morning, and we will turn everything over to you.
Thank you. And I'm just working on getting the share screen going, make sure that we have it on the right page. Can you see my share screen?
I think so, Dr. Parker.
Okay, thank you very much. And I appreciate very much being able to be here with you today. And I think I will go ahead and stop my video for a while, but I'll come back on at the end so that we can, if there are any questions that you have. I'm really excited to share the information with you today. This is what we're going to learn. I wanted to give you just a little bit of an idea of what we're going to spend the next 35, 40 minutes talking about. One thing is, what is traditional ecological knowledge? Why is this traditional ecological knowledge important? And the acronym you might hear that called by sometimes is called TEK. We're going to talk about food sovereignty and what is food sovereignty. Also, why is that important to you and to me, and why is it important to the Chickasaw Nation, and what are we doing to support food sovereignty? I think in this time and period that we're living in, we all have to kind of consider our environment. Hopefully we can say that we have come through a pandemic. I think we're at the very near end of the pandemic, or passed it into what we would call an endemic phase, where COVID is kind of sort of more like the common cold, and that this virus is going to be there, but we were not going to have the numbers that are related to the pandemic. But I ask myself sometimes, how did the pandemic impact us, and why is that important? You know, how did our environment impact us? And so when we think about traditional ecological knowledge, and that is a part of pandemics, because it can be a part of, you know, what happens in life. We think about the perpetuating wisdom of our ancestors, and what is the information that they have handed down to us. And as I was looking at COVID, I actually went back to a pandemic that we went through in earlier, like in 1918, and we had there were stories from tribal members of what people did during that pandemic, and a lot of what they learned had to do with, you know, hygiene and practicing staying away from people who were sick, and having clean water and clean food sources. And so that information is passed down. Those are passed down through stories with families, and that's the traditional ecological knowledge that I'm talking about. There's I call her a famous traditional indigenous chef. Her name is Dr. Lois Ellen Frank, and she says that traditional ecological knowledge is the perpetuating wisdom of the ancestors, and it is important information that is handed down from generation to generation to generation. It's handed down through our traditional songs, our stories, our beliefs, our languages, and even our recipes and the food that we eat. In the Chickasaw Nation, we're a very, and as all tribes are, we're very oral. We pass our traditions down from family to family, and we're storytellers. And so I'm hoping today that it can kind of be like a story for you as I'm sharing about traditional ecological knowledge. And it really has to do with the place that you live, the environment that you live in, and the information that's been handed down over thousands of years, or let's say hundreds of years, or even over decades. One scholar said that concerning this traditional ecological knowledge is that people have relied on that for their own survival. And I like to give an example of, it's kind of a more modern example, and that's whenever the hantavirus struck the Navajo Nation or the Four Corners region in 1993. Here's a picture of that virus. I actually, at the time, was teaching public health nursing at the small university that I teach at here in Oklahoma. And I remember this happening. So, it's actually sort of fresh knowledge for me. This virus struck. And the way it happened is that there was a young lady that presented to emergency department. Her lungs were full of fluid and she died. And it was just like, this was a previously healthy person that you would not have expected to die. And that probably didn't gain a lot of attention other than, of course, with her family. And soon after that, the family was on their way to the funeral, and her boyfriend got sick. They took him to an emergency room and he died. And so he had, his lungs were full of fluid, and there were other deaths that occurred. And there were people that got really sick. And so all of a sudden, an area of the country that, gets attention for a variety of reasons, it's usually not because of sudden deaths like that. So it drew the attention of the Centers for Disease Control. They rushed into the Navajo Nation, and the Navajo people, they have a lot of traditions, a lot of things that we understand and that are practiced. And one is that they don't talk about death very much, and the other is that they really did not have a lot of trust in the CDC. So you have all these literally white coat, people coming in with their white medical coats and trying to figure out what was going on. And then you had a people that didn't want to talk to them about it. And so they had to really figure out, how are we going to get together and solve this? And what they did is just sitting down together, talking. They began talking to the Navajo, and the Navajo shared with them some of their oral tradition about this virus. And so though they did not understand that they were talking about a virus necessarily, they just knew from their past that this had happened in seasons before. And the seasons that they came to be recognized that were occurring would be like during a season with, say with El Nino, there's a lot of rain. And so this would be seasons where there would be a lot of rain. With a lot of rain, you're going to have a proliferation of food sources for rodents. So the pinyons were, pines and the plants that grow in that region, they do very well. I mean, there's a lot of times that it's very, very dry, but so this season, it was really wet. Pinon nuts, there were a lot of those. And so the mice proliferated. And so the Navajo over the generations had realized that this would happen, and there would be some deaths. And so what they came to understand is that you don't want to live with the mice. You want to have the mice not in your area. And so they were able to come together. And I got a copy of this from the internet. And this shows one of the teaching tools that they put out related to this virus and how to handle it. But it took the elders sharing their traditional ecological knowledge, and then the CDC doing some studies and discovering, that is exactly what happened. The Navajo didn't really realize necessarily that from the droppings of the mouse, or even a bite from the mouse, that this disease could be transmitted, that from the droppings, the virus would become aerosolized. You would breathe that virus in, and that's how people were getting, the transmission of the hantavirus, and it was called hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. And so, but with that, they were able to do some teaching and help people to do things for prevention. And this is like, these mice were very, very small. They could actually like go through a buttonhole, not a tiny one, but a pretty good sized buttonhole. So you needed to be able to fix your homes where they couldn't get in. You needed to be able to, get rid of dead mice, get rid of the droppings, make it where you didn't have an environment that was so easy for the mice to live in your home. And so that was an example of traditional ecological knowledge just being practiced and right in front of our very eyes in 1993. And if you actually, discover and look at, Google about hantavirus, you'll see that it's not only in the Four Corners region. I mean, there have been deaths even in Oklahoma. They're not very common. It doesn't happen very often. But in this one season, they had a lot of it happen because of the rains. And so that's just something to think about. And why is it important to have this traditional ecological knowledge? It's actually a term that was used by Western science. It's based on intrinsic and intertwined connection with the land. And what we think about it in tribes is that our tribes still use traditional plants. They use grasses in ceremonies. And so this information has been passed down to us over the generations, even though we have moved from what was our traditional homeland, but we still find these to be very, very useful and very necessary for our tribes. And so this is information that's been shared with us. And so what tribal people do is ask that those grasses be preserved. There was a time that the federal government came in and killed all of the food sources for the Western tribes. And that was, I say all, but a lot. They slaughtered buffalo. And the tribes in those times and periods were using buffalo for their food, for their clothing, for teepees, for just even the bones could be used for an awl or something that could punch holes, in leather, so that they use so much of that. And so there you can see how that that knowledge, that information was a part of what some tribes, and not all tribes, that there are more than 500 in the United States. There are 39 in Oklahoma alone. And so not all tribes did the same. Not all tribes have teepees. My tribe in particular, the Chickasaw Nation, teepees were not the places that we lived. So buffalo hide would maybe not have been so important to us, but the Western tribes, it would have. So those are just some examples of things that have changed even in our environments over the periods of times, over the decades, that we've had to learn how to adapt. And so I thought I'd share that with you. And to kind of, let's say, segue into and start talking about traditional ecological knowledge, food sovereignty, and the native cuisine that we have now. There are 4 periods that have been identified. And the first period was the pre-contact foods. And as you'll see on your list here, these foods included squash, potato, tomato, cacao, which is like chocolate comes from that, corn, beans, chili, and vanilla. And these foods were traded. And so pre-contact foods would be prior to European contact. And I wanted to point out that what you frequently now will hear people talk about when you're talking about American Indians or Native American is First American. And so if you hear me say that, I don't want to throw you off, but that's just kind of just a language change that's occurring as we're describing ourselves. But these first contact foods were really important. And if you'll notice from the list, flour or wheat is not on there. So corn was used by tribes for thousands of years, but wheat was not actually introduced to us until after European contact. During this period of time, first contact foods, and this is talking about that people traded. It's kind of interesting. Another thing that you will see from that list is, or did not see from that list, is that we didn't have mutton. And so as you are, when we think about that Navajo Nation, and I think it's kind of easy to point to them sometimes. The Navajo Nation have so many of their traditions that are still intact, while some of the other tribes do not remember as many of their traditions. But the Navajo Nation really has done that. But they did not have sheep, so mutton was not common to them. In my own tribe, the Chickasaw Nation, we didn't have horses. We didn't even have a word for the horse. And so our word for horse actually derives from the deer. And so that we had to describe sort of like what a deer without antlers would look like. So, things change as we progress, and as time moves on, you'll see the, different things that happen because the environment changes, where we live may change, and then also the foods that we're in contact with. And so the next period that we would talk about would be the historic period of the government issue period. And this one it's sometimes described as a painful period of time. And, but there have been some things that have come out of that have, I guess, just growth. Let's call it that. But during the government issue period, that would be more going back to when we had our relocation, and I'm speaking specifically right now of the Chickasaw Nation. And I'm thinking about government allocations for food, which came basically usually from the United States Department of Agriculture and the food distribution programs. And the foods that were brought into our diets during that period of time are listed here for you. And it's lard, flour, coffee, beans, sugar, and canned meat. And of that list, the only thing that was a food that we were really used to was beans. Now, there may be different kinds of beans, but we did know beans. And so that one was there. But flour, as you can see, that's one that we didn't have. And so I'd like to kind of just explain to you during this government issue period how it changed our diets. It really changed our diets forever. And we had something that came out of it that I would think it's good. It's something that I like. And if you haven't ever had an Indian taco, if I had questions, I would have asked how many have had an Indian taco before. A lot of tribes make them, but this was actually a combination of a lot of different periods. It's a very well-known Native American dish, and it was developed with the government issue rations, traditional indigenous foods that our ancestors had for survival, and also some of those foods that came during the trading period. We didn't have all of those foods all over the United States. But the things that we used from the government issued is that we had wheat flour, baking powder, lard, and then later on processed cheese. And if you've ever seen or heard anyone talk about the commodity program, the processed cheese was like or it still is, it's like a block or a brick of cheese that's literally probably 10 inches long and, a 4-inch square. It's a huge chunk of cheese. I like it. Every once in a while. I actually get some of that put in my lunch whenever I go to one of the food programs. But those were foods that we put together. Of course, we had beans already. We had meat or wild game, and we had chilies and tomatoes. And so what people do to make an Indian taco is that we make a food called a fry bread, which was from the lard and the flour that we did not have. And that can be a little bit different from one tribe to another. The recipes are all very similar, has lard, flour, and a little, I think, baking powder. I've never actually tried to make one of these. I eat them often, but I don't bake fry bread. and then they would have salt in them. And this would just be a fried bread. And then we would put on top of it the things that you would normally think of as a taco. And so we were able to take the three, actually the 3 to 4 time periods and put that together and make a food that a lot of people like. And so that's kind of an idea of how that over time that we've been able to adapt. And hopefully, if you haven't had one, you'll want to go out and find one of those. But the government issue period really changed our diets in a lot of ways. And a lot of those ways were not really necessarily positive, but we're able to work with the federal government and help make some changes to those programs. And we'll talk about that some more too as we continue to talk and look at food sovereignty. The government issue period, kind of the way it impacted Oklahoma. And if I had another question that popped up, I might ask you who was from Tupelo, Mississippi. And you might say Elvis Presley, and I would say, actually, we were there first. So the Chickasaw Nation, that is part of our traditional homeland. We were in the eastern part of the United States, but Mississippi was like one of the last parts that we were in before the westward movement occurred. Settlers moved west into what was called Indian country, and so the federal government came up with a Federal Indian Removal Act of 1830. And so sometime after 1830, a lot of the tribes that were in the east were moved westward and to Oklahoma. And so the Chickasaw Nation came to Oklahoma, which we called at that time, it was not Oklahoma, it was called Indian Territory. And you might have even seen that in literature as IT is the way it would be. So it wasn't Oklahoma until 1907. And so if you think about the traditional ecological knowledge, well, those foodways were pretty well interrupted. There was a disruption of the way we got our meat, the way we, got our foods, grew foods, the way we communicated, our culture, and even our belief of the land, because we were not as nomadic as some tribes. We moved around some. We had, houses for summer, houses for winter, but we weren't like tribes that were truly nomadic that, moved across a lot of different states regularly. But we were more settled in that one area, but we moved here, and it really disrupted things. It changed things with our diets, that we will never be where we were with the pre-contact foods, but we were able to move to Oklahoma. And there are some similarities. I've been to our homelands, and there's very definitely some similarities, but it's not exactly the same. There's been a lot of change. And those are the 3 food periods to start with, but I want to introduce you now to a 4th period that happened after our removal, after we moved to Oklahoma. And it's called the new First American cuisine. And so you see there where I talk about it as the First American, and it is new. And so what we're doing, it's in a period, and as Dr. Lois Ellen Frank would say, it's a very exciting period of time, because what we're doing is reintroducing some of those traditional First American, some of the foods that we had previously. We're trying to teach our citizens how to cook healthy foods, healthy indigenous foods, healthy foods that we get now. We're beginning to practice more of what we would call food sovereignty. And I think that that's one that we should all do, whether we're First American or whatever. I think every person should practice food sovereignty, and we'll get that explained more clearly to you as we move along. We have a movement of what I call First American chefs. And actually, when Dr. Frank was thinking about, working on a PhD, and she said she wanted to work on her food was about First First Americans cuisine, and she was told First Americans don't have a cuisine. And so she corrected them over time. And now not only does she have books and she teaches at a college in Santa Fe, but there are a lot of chefs that have joined her on the world stage scene and have really become quite popular. And so you can actually find cookbooks about that if you're so interested. And then we also have the question of what foods make up our cuisine. So we have a lot of opportunity in this this little book that I have. This is a picture of a recipe book, Recipes Wrapped with Love. And the Chickasaw Nation actually made this cookbook. I use it myself. It uses some of the food distribution foods, or you might hear it called commodity foods. It uses some of those foods that our citizens get. And it doesn't have some of the newer foods that are in the food distribution program, and we'll talk about those too. But this has some of the other old ones, and we're able to help our citizens find out how you can make a healthier diet, with those foods that were given in the food package. And one of the examples that I would share with you is that there are some tribes that they're kind of, the question is, okay, the Indian taco was not our traditional food. Are we going to keep that? Or are we going to perhaps say that that's not what we want to do? Or do we want to make it healthier? The one thing that some of the tribes are doing, and some cooks and chefs are doing, is that rather than making it a fry bread, they're more like baking it. So it still has the white flour, still has the powder and the baking powder, salts and water, but it's not fried. And so obviously that would be what I would call a healthier food. And so those are just questions and things that people are doing as we're considering. Food sovereignty is basically saying, what do we as a tribe want to eat? What do we want to consider that would be healthy for us and turn us back into being a healthier people, helping us to decrease the amount of obesity that we have, the amount of heart disease and diabetes, because we know a lot of that can be changed by what you eat, and also the foods, the way you live. So there are some things that we can do. So the question now is that, what is food sovereignty? It's the right to choose which foods you eat, choosing where your foods come from, how are your foods grown, and then also I wanted to share that food sovereignty is very important to tribal sovereignty. Tribal sovereignty is when a tribe basically says that, we want to govern ourselves. So we also want to govern our food and what do we eat, what is important to us. And I'll give you an example of this, is that in the food distribution program there's a certain food package. And so our nutrition programs are able to choose from that food package. And every tribe in all of the 500 tribes were getting the same package. Everybody got the same foods, the same cheese, the same canned meat, the same beans, everything was the same. And so what tribes began doing is asking, we'd like to see the food package changed. So in 1991, there's a group called, acronym is NAFDIPR. It's a National Food Distribution on Indian Reservation, and it's a work group that asked the FNS, or the distribution, the federal government program, to allow us to add, we wanted to add bison or buffalo to the food package, and so that our tribes could get food. And the answer at that time was no, because that was not, buffalo was not a domestic animal. So it wasn't a cow. And so we had some members of this group who are still part of this. I mean, they're still working day in and day out, working with the food distribution programs, but they began working with the growers of bison or buffalo, and also the FNS and asking them, and sharing with them about buffalo, that it was something that tribal people ate. So it took some education. They finally, in 1993, agreed to let us do that. And so the very first time that the food was shared, it was, they said the buffalo was horrible. It was just not, it was very bloody and just, it wasn't packaged well. And so it really took an education process. There's an Intertribal Bison Council, and these are native breeders, and they offered education on how to actually package, how buffalo is slaughtered and processed, which is a little bit different than beef. And we now have the buffalo or bison in our programs, and tribes all across the United States are able to use buffalo. So that's just an example. And it goes back to, as we were talking about early, that traditional ecological knowledge, that buffalo was a meat that was good. It was what, our tribal people wanted to eat. And now we're teaching a lot of different tribes, how buffalo can be used. What are we doing to encourage food sovereignty? And I just wanted to share with you one of the examples. We talked about the recipe book. I think that is one way. Tribal recipes that are shared. Practicing food sovereignty is sharing this traditional ecological knowledge and then putting it into practice, because those stories have to be passed on. They have to be shared. And so the kitchen of people that put together that recipe book, it was actually tribal elders. They used those recipes, they tried them out, they perfected them, and they made it where that we could share those, and we could share those with our citizens as we're working to improve not only our native cuisine or our First Americans cuisine, but also improve the quality of our diet. These are some examples of some of the programs that we have where in the Chickasaw Nation, we practice food sovereignty. They're under a program that we call Impa Kilimpi, which means strong food. And this program has a lot of different aspects to it. And so I'll share some of those with you. But the employees of this program, we have some of our elders that work with them. We have nutrition educators. We have registered dietitians. We have people that are very educated that help us and help our senior citizens put together recipes and programs that are tailored for our tribe, for the Chickasaw Nation. And that's a part of tribal sovereignty, is where every tribe is working together and looking at their tribe and how can we make things healthier? What can we do to improve the health of our people? And so this Eagle Adventure book, this is actually a program that started like in the 90s, actually 1997. The Tribal Leaders Diabetes Committee, which was a group made of tribal leaders from all of the Indian Health Service areas, which there are 12 of them. We partnered with the CDC. We came up with a book series. This actually has children's books that are they are really illustrated and written by tribal people. We have adolescent books that just teach a healthier lifestyle, and it's using what is common for us, which is the storytelling. And the Eagle books, that's something that you could actually Google and find out about the Eagle books. They're still available for the CDC. We have puppets that went along with those. And there have been stories for this now more than 2 decades where tribes have used this, which was a collaborative between the Tribal Leaders Diabetes Committee, tribal leaders, and the Centers for Disease Control. And so that's a great way to use knowledge that's shared by experts and with tribal members to help come up with programs that will help improve the life and the health of our citizens. In the Chickasaw Nation, we are actually now working on a story series similar to that, but it is more tailored specifically toward Chickasaw people. Another one is the Impa Kilimpi Strong Food. And I kind of referred to this one, but in this program, we grow fruits and vegetables that are distributed to our participants through the food distribution programs. And we're growing, we have gardens, we have gardens that are, in people's homes. We have gardens that are we even have one garden I remember in particular that some of our grade school children planted and put in at one of the health clinics. And so we were growing strawberries in an atrium. But those are things that we're doing to share information, to teach our tribal members, to teach the citizens of our tribe what we can do to improve our health, and do it from a cultural perspective that is specific to us. And so we have these federal programs, and but we need to also be able to adopt those so that those federal programs work for us. And one of the things that another food that we've added in is blue corn. Well, our tribe didn't know what to do with blue corn because that was more for the tribes from the West. And so our nutritionists had to reach out to some of those programs from the Western tribes and ask them, what is it you do to make the blue corn tasteful? Because the way we were cooking, it didn't work very well. The other thing that's being added back in right now is salmon. And salmon, of course, it's not something I eat every day because I was actually born in Texas and raised in Oklahoma. I know that a lot of people do eat salmon, but it would be more a food that would be tailored to tribes from the Northeast. And so they share their recipes with us. And then in the food distribution program, when our tribal members get salmon, they also get a card that shows them how to cook the salmon. And so to me, that is taking traditional ecological knowledge and it's sharing from one tribe to another. And it's us then practicing our food sovereignty by sharing that with our tribal members and sharing with them how they can cook that. This is an example of our gardens. These are grown every year. The vegetables are shared with our senior citizens. They are shared in some of our food programs where we have our lunches. And so the senior citizens will come to those lunches. And then when they go home, they may go home that day with, a bag full of squash or a bag full of cucumbers. Our children are being able to share with those. And so it's just us realizing that we can grow vegetables. You don't always have to go to a store. You can learn how to do some of that for yourself. So that's why I said everybody can practice food sovereignty. And I think that we should. I think that we should be able to do that, particularly in the season that we're in. We don't know how, foods are going to be disrupted. So it might be nice this summer to know how to grow your own squash. And even this, you can have, if you live like we do out in the country or something, you can have chickens and you can have your own eggs. This is actually my grandson sharing the first time their chicken laid eggs, and they were so excited. But kids get really excited about this whenever they get to help grow the food. They get to help harvest it, help plant the seeds. These kids that summer that they planted kale, and really everything else we planted didn't work. It's a learning process. But the kale worked. It actually became one of our favorite salads at Christmas because we put a strawberry dressing on it and it was just so pretty. It was green and red. But that was practicing food sovereignty. We were eating a very healthy salad. We grew it ourselves and it just kind of makes you feel good. So I would just encourage you that's something that we probably ought to do. We practice food sovereignty with our seniors. We have a farmers market program. And those are foods that are grown locally. And then what we do for our seniors is that we give them vouchers so that they can take some of those vouchers, or if it's our WIC participants, which, is a federal program for women, infants, and children, but they also can take those vouchers and go down and purchase foods that are grown right here in Oklahoma. We're not carting them in from another part of the country. We actually grow them here. They can grow those May through October, or eat those, or purchase them. And we share recipes. And then in the winter months, we give our seniors a basket or a bag of vegetables every month. And those are going to be filled with recipe cards. And I think you might ask me, well, are those your traditional foods? Well, no, not necessarily. But in practicing food sovereignty, we kind of get to decide, do we want to eat those foods or not? Do I want to eat zucchini? Well, yes, I do. Do I want to learn how to cook eggplant? Yes, I do, because I think it's healthy. It's good for me. So that's me practicing food sovereignty. Will I eat salmon? Yes, I will, even though I'm having to learn to like salmon. And y'all all may be thinking I'm behind the times, because I know a lot of people really like salmon. And then our farmers nutrition programs, again, we cater to and help work to provide foods for our first American seniors. And for us, that's 55 and older, which is pretty neat. We get to set the age. Our seniors, anybody with a disability, our warriors, our Chickasaw Nation Warrior Society is our veterans, and we call them the Warrior Society. And then the program for women, infants, and children. And I think the last thing I was just going to say, that these programs are beneficial. Like going here, this is the summer program. Those are some of our tribal elders buying those vegetables. It becomes a place to share, to communicate, to see others, and but also at the same time, you're learning how to buy healthier foods and to share those healthy foods with your family, and hopefully have then a healthier lifestyle. One last little thing that we did is that we added in electronic benefit cards so that our citizens could, rather than carry a big white piece of paper that says, hey, I'm somebody in need, I'm in a food distribution program, it's a lot more respectful to be able to share a card that's the size of a credit card. Testimonies we've had, and I could just go on and on about this, but I think I'm probably about at the end. But we've had citizens say that they're so thankful to be able to buy the healthier foods because it helped them to address their own health needs. And then they are able to then take those foods and produce, just buy foods that are better for them, and then be able to give those to their family. You're kind of giving back to your community. And so I think it's a win-win in all ways. And with that, I would just like to say that I think what we've covered today, and I hope you understood what food sovereignty is, what traditional ecological knowledge is, how it's important for us for our cultural preservation, and how to make healthy food choices. And with that, I will say Chapisa Lacho in Chickasaw, which is until I see you again. Thank
Gosh,
you.
thank you. Thank you for this wonderful presentation, Dr. Parker. We would now like to open up the floor for questions. Feel free to type those questions into the chat. And Dr. Parker, we do have a couple that were asked while you were presenting. The first of them is, how does climate change affect food sovereignty?
I think that what people have to be aware of, and I didn't say this to you all earlier, but climate change in Oklahoma is something like, they say, if you are not happy with the weather today, wait 3 or 4 days, wait 3 or 4 hours, and the weather will change. And I think that we can just anticipate that change is going to occur, and change has occurred already. If you go back, 1,000 years, things are different. And so we just adapt over time. And so that would be my thought. We adapt over time, and just learn to grow things and take care of ourselves in the environment that we're in, because change is a given. And I think climate change is, it does happen, but in Oklahoma, it happens fast.
Thank you for that. Our next question is, you mentioned Recipes Wrapped with Love being a book, and we did share a a link to the website in the chat. Is there a print version of Recipes Wrapped with Love available, or is it primarily or only digital at this point?
Actually, it is a print version, but I am not aware if people can buy it outside of the Chickasaw Nation. And so I would have to say on that one that we might have to find out the answer if someone would like to know.
Thank you. Wonderful. Have root vegetables been very popular with folks in the Chickasaw Nation?
Well, of course, we do eat a lot of root vegetables in our gardens. We grow carrots, which I would call a root vegetable, and of course, potatoes, and then turnips. And one that I didn't mention, and I've never heard somebody say that onions are a root vegetable, but I know that they grow under the ground. So I would, correct me if I'm wrong, but we do have a traditional food called wild onions, and that's something that our tribal people like a lot. But some of the things that we had kind of gotten away from, like beets and turnips, and those are foods that are given in our food packages, like in those winter bags, and encouraging people to learn to eat those again, because I think we've changed and we're all trying to learn to eat what I would call healthier vegetables, and root vegetables are definitely a healthy food.
Excellent, thank you. So I have another kind of a multi-part question here for you. Are there larger initiatives where communities developing local food sovereignty initiatives can share ideas? Or is it more like informal networks? The person who asked this says that their public health students are very interested in food sovereignty, but researching so many local movements online can be challenging.
I think that I know I'm more aware just of what our tribe does. And with the food distribution program, as I was mentioning that, if you wanted to look into the National Food Distribution Program on Indian reservations, that is actually a group that you could look at to see how tribal groups are working together. Because in that group, that national group, which I am a part of, there are representatives from all regions of the United States. So we have, tribes from the Far East, tribes from the Southeast, tribes from the West and the Northeast, and those all get together and they do share information. And so that would be the part that I'm familiar with. And I would encourage you to look up that for the National Food Distribution on Indian Reservations. And we call it NAFDIPR.
Thank you. Okay, so what are the best approaches for community organizations to partner with Native or First American tribes?
I actually think it's communication. Right now, I work with a community group through our county health department, and we have monthly meetings. We go to those meetings. And I remember not too long ago, somebody asked me, what are the programs? Because a lot of the programs that we had previously that community people participated in were, stopped because of COVID. And so I reached out and just asked the programs that the Chickasaw Nation has, and they were just so willing to share that with the community group. So I think it's just people talking to each other and asking, what's available. The other thing on back on that other question, I think the Department of Agriculture, there's a lot of information, a lot of education that the Department of Agriculture shares with tribes. So that might be another place for your public health students to do some of their search.
And this may be a bit of an extension to that previous question, so forgive me if this is maybe redundant or if you've already answered it, but how can organizations bring awareness to food sovereignty in Native and First American tribes?
How can they bring awareness to food sovereignty? Not sure I understand the question exactly. I do think that we all need to be aware of food sovereignty. It sounds like a sort of an unusual concept, but it really is when we practice deciding what am I going to eat, what's the healthy food for me to eat, we are practicing food sovereignty on our own. So I think in a way, just that we all as a world are getting used to food sovereignty. We're doing it already, but you need to be able to make educated decisions. So I know that's a kind of vague answer, but I'm trying to fit it to what I think the question might have been asking.
Thank you. That's wonderful, Dr. Parker. And we just do have one more question. What is your favorite traditional First Americans dish?
Actually, there is a food, and it's like probably not back to prior to European contact, but it's called grape dumplings, and you could look that up. I'm not saying that it's very healthy. It is made, the dumpling is very similar to like when you have chicken and dumplings, that sort of dumpling consistency. And then the grape is actually the juice part is made out of grape juice, and it's probably thickened with cornstarch. And I know that that is not a really, really good answer, but it came through the government distribution part of our cuisine, because it was those foods that were added into our diets. But it's really tasty, and every year we have a festival, and that's one of the foods that they serve. And then another one is very, very common, and it's called pashofa, and that's made with pork and also a cracked corn, almost like a white corn, like a hominy corn. And so you could probably Google both of those, because I've done that before. A lot of tribes cook pashofa, but ours does, and we cook them in these, traditionally they would be cooked in these huge black kettles, like over an open flame. I've had it that way, and I've had it cooked over someone's electric stove, and they're both really great. So grape dumplings and the pashofa.
That sounds delicious. I certainly identify with that too. There's something really special about those recipes that have been honed over many generations. They're certainly
Yes.
heartwarming. So, well, thank you so much, Dr. Parker, for this presentation. And I am going to hand things back over to Edward.
Thanks for watching. This video was produced by the network of the National Library of Medicine. Select the circular channel icon to subscribe to our channel, or select a video thumbnail to watch another video from the channel.